Well, first, I would like to thank the organizers for organizing this wonderful conference and including our paper on the program. So today I'm going to talk about a paper studying the relationship between investor social media and financial markets. So this work is joined with my awesome co-author, Cookson, Mullins, and Marina Niessner. So without further ado, let me get started. Well, social media use in the past 2 decades has seen an exponential growth. So nowadays, Americans on average spend 3.6 hours per day on social media. And this number is similar for Chinese also. Now, many people start to use social media as their primary news source. And many firms also disclose firm information on social media and use that to engage with their investors. Now, the 2021 GameStop trading frenzy also exemplified the role of social media in financial markets and also the rising tendency for investors to use social media signal in trading. Now, this rising prominence of social media prompts a growing literature in finance to focus on investor social media. So what is investor social media? Just to give you a basic idea of what is investor social media, here I list 3 major investor social media platforms nowadays. So StockTweet, Twitter, and Seeking Alpha. And I'm also gonna give you some example posts to help you better understand this investor social media. So for Twitter, everybody should be quite familiar with it. It features short posts. Now for Seeking Alpha, it's very similar to Twitter in that it also features short posts. Well, the difference is that for Seeking Alpha, for StockTweet, they allow users to label their message as being bullish or bearish using this little button here. Now, for Seeking Alpha, this is a platform featuring longer articles with more in-depth analysis. So here, this is just one screenshot of a summary. Here's a much longer article afterwards. So these would be the 3 major investor platforms that we look at today. Now, when the literature studies the investor social media, they tend to focus on one single platform at a time. And what they do is that they will treat each platform as representative of the social media in general. However, as the examples I gave you just now, you see that these different platforms differ in myriad of ways. So for example, they have different user populations. They have different incentives for users to post tweets. And also, the format and timing of the post could all be different. Now, the goal of this paper is to understand how different is the information generated across different social media platforms. And can we generalize conclusions drawn on one particular platform, say on StockTweet, to social media in general? And in addition, we want to understand whether the information generated on social media is actually distinct from traditional news, or is it just a mere packaging of traditional news, just for people who prefer the format of social media posts. So these will be the 2 questions that we want to tackle in this paper. Now, there are 2 baseline views of social media. The first one is this monolithic view. So in the background, we plot the monolith from the 2001 Space Odyssey. So basically, under this view, different social media platforms would generate similar information to each other. So no matter which platform you look at, you have similar information, and each platform is a good substitute for the other platform. So that's the monolithic view. Now, in contrast, there is this idiosyncratic view of social media. So imagine you blindfold a scientist and ask him or her to touch the elephant and tell you what is an elephant. Now, depending on which part the scientist touching, they may form different interpretations of the same exact elephant. Now, put that into context in social media. It means that depending on which platforms you are looking at, you actually get very different information. So if you buy this view, then you will think social media platforms are not good substitutes to each other. So what are the main findings in this paper? Well, the first thing we do is that we try to distinguish attention signal and sentiment signal on social media platform. In other words, we distinguish between the volume or mentions of a firm from the average bullish or bearish sentiment of a firm. Now, the finding is that attention signal is quite common across platforms. However, sentiment signal is idiosyncratic. In other words, the sentiment information generated on one social media platform is not a good substitute for sentiment information generated on another platform. However, for attention, it is. Now, the second finding is that there is a lot of heterogeneity in firm coverage across platforms. Because of time limit in today's presentation, I won't be able to go into details, but this is part of the result. But in the paper, we showed that small firms are much better covered on some platforms, such as stock tweets. However, for Twitter and Seeking Alpha, they focus on larger cap firms. Now, in addition, we also want to know whether the information generated on social media actually can predict or have information that can predict future returns. And we find that they do. But the interesting thing is that the direction of the prediction is different from sentiment and for attention. So for sentiment, it predicts positive next day returns. Higher the sentiment, higher the next day returns for that firm. However, for attention, it's the opposite. Higher attention today, it predicts more negative returns the next day. And finally, we use two information events to try to understand how platform features and also user composition of these social media platforms could affect the information generated on the platforms. And it turns out these two things could actually be very important factors that explain the difference in information generated across different social media platforms. Okay, so now let me get into the first part of the paper. What is the social signal? To answer this question, we obtained data for three major investor platforms, as I mentioned earlier. The first one is StockTwit. We have message level data, and we can identify the user type, the users who post the messages. So they could be influencers, professional investor, or novice investor, and so on and so forth. Now, for Seeking Alpha, we also have message level data. For Twitter, we only have firm day level data aggregated by the data vendor. So how do we measure attention? To measure attention, we start with a number of posts per day. And then within each platform and day, we then calculate the share of messages about each ticker. So for example, if today on Twitter, there are 100 messages in total, and 30 of them are about Tesla, then the Tesla attention today on Twitter would be 30%. Now, this attention share measure can control for or remove the variation in the volume of total messages posted across time. Now, in the paper, we show that if we change the attention measure to just number of messages, the results go through. In terms of sentiment, so for StockTwit and Seeking Alpha, we have message level sentiment. The way we get this sentiment is that StockTwit or Seeking Alpha, the data vendor, they assign a -1 to +1 value of sentiment to a message. So if that value is -1, is bearish, the most bearish. +1 means the sentiment is the most bullish. And then for this StockTwit and Seeking Alpha, we then average these message level sentiment into a firm day level measure. For Twitter, we already have a firm day level sentiment measure just provided by the data vendor. And just for a ease of interpretation, we normalize both sentiment and attention to 0, 1. Okay, so now we have 6 signals at hand. Attention, sentiment for each of the 3 major investor social media platforms. The first exercise we do is the principal component analysis. We want to know what is the commonality of these different signals across the 3 platforms. So what do we find? So here the table gives you 6 principal components. The first principal component in red is basically attention signals. Well, in contrast, the second principal component in this green bracket is mostly sentiment signals. And this exercise tells us that the principal component analysis actually distinguishes between sentiment and attention signals. They are distinct signals. Now, in addition, a very interesting finding is the fraction of variation that this each principal component explains. So for the attention principal component, which is the first one, it explains about 36% of the total variation. But for sentiment principal component, it only explains about 20%. So attention seems to be able to explain much more variation in the data compared to sentiment signals. And motivated by this exercise, we then, in all following exercises, we treat attention and sentiment as distinct signals and analyze them separately. Okay, so now in what we do is we run 2 separate principal component analysis, one for attention signal and the other one for sentiment signal. Now the main finding here is that for attention signal, the first principal component explains a lot of variation, 67%. And what it means is that attention signal across platforms share very high commonalities. Well, in contrast, when we look at sentiment signals, this the first principal component only explains about 39%. 39% is very low. And why did I say that? Because had we assumed all of these 3 signals across platforms are orthogonal to each other, the first principal component will still explain 33%. And 39% is not very far from 33%. So what it means is that those 3 signals across platforms are actually not very highly correlated in our sample. Now, of course, a lot of interest in the audience must start to get worried, like, well, the patterns in attention and sentiment across platforms may be driven by a lot of unobservables. That's what caused your patterns. So it could be driven by firm-specific news or industry or nationwide news, or it could be driven by like pre-existing firm differences or other firms kind of varying characteristics. So one very straightforward solution would be just to run a simple OLS regression by regressing the signal on one platform on signals on other platforms, controlling for all these potential confounders. However, in our setting, this is not a very ideal solution. The reason is because if we do this, then the relationship between, for example, software signals and trigger signals will be holding all other things constant. But we don't want it. We want to know what's the covariance or just the variation across all signals, but not just the 2 signals themselves. So instead, what we do is a conditional principal component analysis. So essentially, it's quite simple and very straightforward. So basically, the first thing we do is to run a first stage regression, regress stock trace signal on all these potential confounding factors, and then obtain this residual. We do this for all 6 signals, and to get like a cleaned version of the signal, stripping away all possible confounding factors. And then with this cleaned signals, we then run a principal component analysis again. And it turns out, even after controlling for this news, firm fixed effects, and also lag returns and lag volatility, as I shown here, these are all the confounders we throw in the first stage regressions. The principal component analysis still goes through. It means that the attention commonality across platforms, but the idiosyncrasy of sentiment across platforms are not driven by all of these potential confounders. And in the paper, we show that this pattern in sentiment and attention actually holds true even within stock tweets across user groups. And this exercise is quite important because, as you may think, the reason that sentiments so different across platforms. Could be mechanical, it could be just algorithm, the machine learning algorithm or NLP algorithm that you use for different platforms are different. So no wonder the sentiment is not highly correlated across platforms. But even when we would zoom into within stock tweets, which we hold NLP algorithm the same, should look at the signal from different user groups, we still find very high commonality in attention, but very little commonality in sentiment. So that is not a mechanical reason of different natural language processing algorithms they use. And also, in show that these patterns in sentiment and attention is true across firm size distribution. Although for larger firms, the commonality across platform is usually higher than smaller firms. In other words, if you have conclusions for smaller firms from just one platform, it may be not so generalized to other platforms. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is how these social signals that we just see relate to future returns. Does it have any additional information that can help us predict future return? Now, the null hypothesis is that, well, maybe social media does not have any additional information on top of traditional news. So they should not predict future returns if we control for news. And let's see whether that's the case. Well, it turns out it's not the case. Otherwise, we will not have a paper here. So basically, what we do here is that we regress next day returns on sentiment signal, attention signal, and also the interaction between them. So columns 1, 2, and 3 do it by each platform, and column 4, what we do is we regress the next day returns on the first physical component for sentiment and attention, and the interaction between them. And it turns out sentiment signal predicts positive next day returns, but attention signal predicts negative next day returns. And this conclusion is true across different firm size distribution, and even after controlling for a lot of different things. For example, current or lag news, lag returns volatility, so on and so forth. So it turns out this attention and sentiment signals on social media indeed contain information for future returns, even conditional on traditional news and, for example, a traditional way of measuring retail investor attention, which is Google ASBI. Okay, so in the remaining of the time, I would like to use 2 information events to understand the mechanisms or channels through which information is generated on these social media platforms. The reason that we do this is because we want to understand what are the factors that contributing to the differences in sentiment signal that we saw earlier. So the first information event that we'll look at is the stock tweet character limit increase. So on May 8, 2019, stock tweets increased the number of characters per message from 140 to 1,000. This is quite helpful because unlike Twitter, stock tweets do not allow users to thread multiple posts into a longer one. So what we want to do with this exercise is that we want to test if a platform feature, an important platform feature such as the character limit change, would it drive differences in information generated across platforms? Well, communication theory predicts that it will. So what is communication theory? So this is a quite old and developed theory from the 1960s. Its slogan says the medium is the message. It means that any effects or features of the medium that generates this message will affect who participates in the medium, and also what information is generated on the medium, and thus will affect the content or information on that medium. So just to help you understand what would be our hypothesis here. So here on the figure, what we do is we plot the different percentiles of number of characters per message from before the character limit increase to after the character limit increase. So you can see that, so on the very top, 90 percentile, 75, 50, and 25. So you can see that for the upper percentiles, there is a significant increase in the number of characters per message. It means that for users who want to write long messages, they suddenly are able to do it thanks to this character limit increase. However, for users who are at a they always want to just post short message, they don't care about this character limit increase because they just write short messages. They were not constrained before and they are not constrained after. So the prediction here is that the character limit increase on stock tweets should affect the information generated on stock tweets. However, it should not affect information on Twitter or Zhengyang Alpha because there's no change on those two platforms. And in addition, we expect the effect on stock tweets to be larger for longer messages because these users, because the users who want to write longer messages are the people that were constrained before, but their constraint was relieved after the stock tweet character limit change. So what do we find? So what we found is that indeed the informativeness of sentiment signal on stock tweets improved after this character limit change. So in column 1, what we do, we regress, next we return on the sentiment signal and attention signal for stock tweets, as well as the interaction between a post dummy and the two signals. And what you see is that after the stock tweet character limit increase, sentiment signal on stock tweets improved its informativeness of next day returns. And this improved informativeness is predominantly coming from the signal from longer messages. The reason I said that is because in column 2, we zoom into the signal generated from longer messages on stock tweets, and you see that the effect size is double. Very importantly, in columns 3 and 4, we look at Twitter and Zhengyang Alpha, and we find that the sentiment signal on these two columns, the informativeness did not change after the stock tweet character limit increase. And this is quite helpful because it tells us that the effect we documented in column 1 and 2 is not driven by some common shocks to all social media platforms. It's very specific to stock tweets. Now, the second information event we look at is the GME trading frenzy in January 2021. So during that event, a lot of retail investors on Wall Street Bets, which is a Reddit subforum, they coordinated with each other to form a short squeeze strategy and implement it on a lot of stocks such as GME, AMC, and that and beyond. And they did so against the traditionally more powerful institutional investors. Now, these events substantially changed the composition and attitudes of retail investors. And suddenly, everybody is paying attention to the retail trading. So our goal of using this information event is to understand what is the impact of new ideas, new trading ideas, and also, more importantly, new users on the information generated on social media. And why new users? So new users are actually very important in this case, because in late 2019, early 2020, brokerage opened up the floodgate to retail investors by allowing for low cost or no cost trading. And combined with the pandemic stay-at-home order as well as stimulus check, a lot of retail investors entered the stock market. And those retail investors started to congregate and coordinate with each other and start this strategy. Now, how did these retail investors coordinate with each other? Well, by mentioning a lot of short squeezes online. So here, what I do is I plot the number of mentions of short squeeze, this keyword, on stock tweets before versus after the GME trading frenzy, which is this vertical line. The blue dotted line represents new users. These are users who joined stock tweets after January 2020. And then we also plotted for the black line, which is the old users that joined before. And you can see that for new users, they increase a lot of the mentions for short tweets, but the mean, it's not much different for the old users. Before versus after, they mention similarly for short tweets. So the goal of this exercise is to test if new users generate different information compared to all users, and whether they contribute to the differences in information generated across different platforms. Now, according to past papers, it should. So Bradley and co-authors, they had a paper studying the red due diligence reports. These are pretty tightly argued cases about firms, and what they found is that this quality or informativeness of this red due diligence report deteriorated substantially following an influx of new users onto Reddit after this GME short squeeze event. So we expect to see similar things on these 3 social media platforms that we look at also. So what do we do here is that, again, we regress the next return onto the principal component signals, sentiment and attention. So the first 2 columns tells you that the informativeness of the sentiment principal component signals on the 3 major platforms deteriorated after the GME short fix because the interaction is significant and negative. And also, this significant negative coefficient basically wipe out the informativeness on a sentiment signal before the short squeeze event, making the sentiment signal no longer informative in the post period of the GME event. Now, in columns 3 and 4, we focus on signals for new users on subtweet and all users for subtweet. And we show that the deterioration in the informativeness of the sentiment principal component is basically coming from the new users, not the old users. So this suggests that these new users actually contribute to the deterioration of informativeness of the sentiment principal component. Okay, just to quickly summarize, what we found in this paper is that first, we distinguish sentiment and attention. We show that sentiment signal is idiosyncratic, but attention signal is pretty common across platforms. And this suggests that the findings suggest that we should push against generalizing single platform study on sentiment to all the other platforms. And also, this is especially true for small firms, because the signal for small firms is much more idiosyncratic compared to signals for larger firms. And in addition, we show that attention and sentiment signal have market relevant information. It does predict future returns, although they have opposite signs. And finally, we use 2 information events to try to convince you that platform features and user composition both matter a lot for the informativeness of sentiment signal. And that could be a reason why we see such a high idiosyncrasy in sentiment signal across different platforms. And that's all for my presentation. Thank you for your time.
The discussant is Zhengyang from City University of Hong Kong.
All right, thanks for the opportunity to discuss this very interesting paper. So Runjing has done a great job presenting the details. So what I'm going to do is just to briefly summarize the paper within one slide. So the paper asks the following interesting question. Different social platforms provide different marketing information. And as Rich mentioned, there are 2 parts of this question. The first part is whether the information provided is different across social platforms. And the answer turns out to depend on the nature of the signals. So if we're talking about attention paid to individual stocks, they tend to be common across platforms. So basically, the social platform user, they pay attention to the same stock on the same day. If we're talking about the degree of optimism, which is how the paper defines sentiment, then it is more idiosyncratic. The second part of the question is whether the social signal they provide some useful market information. And the answer is an accounting yes. So when the user on the stock clicks, they pay more attention to a particular stock, the stock tends to have lower returns next day. And when social platform users, they are more optimistic about the stock, regardless of the social platforms we're talking about, the stock is going to have higher returns next day. And very importantly, the authors show that this return predictability is distinct from that of traditional news coverage, unscheduled corporate events, or earnings announcements. So in terms of the amount of market information embedded in those signals, the authors use two information events to show that it is influenced by platform features and also the composition of it. So I think this paper addresses a very timely and important topic because investors nowadays, they rely heavily on social platforms to obtain and exchange information. So understanding those social signals is crucial to understand how information affects market outcomes. So I've been also, following this team's other work on social platforms, for example, the actual Chambers paper. So this other team always delivers impressive work. This paper is no exception, and they have assembled a very rich data set to understand those social signals. So my discussion today is going to provide some empirical background to the audience, and my comments are mainly about how to utilize this very rich data set. So since this paper provides a stock level measure based on the social platforms in terms of attention and optimism, I'm going to give some background on some existing measures also at the stock level for attention and optimism. So first, for attention, we have the retail investor Google search activity by the seminal work by Da et al. 2011. So they find that when the abnormal Google research volumes goes up for an individual stock, the stock tends to have higher returns in the next 2 weeks, followed by reverse options. They argue that this pattern is consistent with the observation that retail investors tend to have under-diversified portfolios and face very strong short sale constraint. As a result, their buying decision is more heavily influenced by attention and a possible buying pressure as well. On the institutional investor side, there are several papers that use new search and new reading activities to measure their attention. So a general conclusion from this literature is that when institutional investors pay more attention to information, the price reaction tends to be more efficient at the stock level, and also these investors tend to have better investment performance. These two types of attention, retail and also institutional, they're also different from each other. So neither measure is captured by alternative indirect measures from the early papers, like stock level turnover, market size, or volatility. And it's been found that the institutional attention tends to lead the retail attention, and the retail attention leads other alternatives indirect. For optimism, we also have several measures for different investor groups. So sort of capturing the institutional optimism, we have the analyst earnings forecast as in Boulder et al. 2019. So they find that when analysts are more optimistic about a firm's future cash flow, its stock tends to have a lower return in the next year in the process. On the retail investor side, there have been a couple of existing papers that also use social platform activities. So I'm not going to dig into the details here, but a general finding from the social platform activity is that when retail investors become more optimistic about the stock tends to have lower returns. So given all these different existing measures of attention and optimism, I'm wondering whether more can be learned using very rich data set in terms of about this new measure of attention and optimism based on social platforms, which is new out of this thing. So the authors show that the attention tends to be homogeneous across social platforms, but still this social platform attention can be distinct from other direct measures, like previously based on search engines or new reading and research activity. So I'm wondering whether the author can show that this social platform attention can explain some of variations in search engine attention or institutional attention, and whether this social platform attention leads or lags behind other direct measures. I would also like to know more about the drivers of this homogeneous social platform attention. So here I highlight two particular factors that I think might be interesting. So the first one is brand building. So it can be argued that a stock with wide field distribution, this kind of lottery stock, can be potentially attention grabbing. And this wide field stocks tend to be overpriced in the cross section, as shown by Barbaros et al. 2016 data. So if you combine these two observations together, it can provide a rationale for this negative return predictability induced by the attention. A second factor, which also is very relevant in this social platform context, is the presence of influencers. So maybe the presence of some strong influencer or some stock are driving very homogeneous attention, either within or across platforms. A very interesting finding from this paper is that optimism tends to be idiosyncratic or heterogeneous across platforms. And I would also like to know more about the drivers of this heterogeneity. So the authors have mentioned maybe the coverage heterogeneity is one potential factor. And another possibility motivated by the finding from Da et al. 2021 is that maybe different user groups they extrapolate from past returns to a different extent. So my second comment is that I think an additional social signal can be extracted from the very rich data set, which is disagreement. Again, this is motivated by the very interesting findings that optimism tends to be idiosyncratic across platforms. So in my view, this sounds like a low-hanging fruit because part of the author team, Tony and Marina, they already have a GF paper in place that studies the investor and group level disagreements within one of the social platforms, the stock trades that being studied in the paper. So I think it is very straightforward to construct several additional points. So for example, we can start with the within platform disagreement for the two additional social platforms, the Twitter and CPL. And once we have those within platform disagreement measures, it is also very straightforward to calculate and measure of the cross-platform disagreement. Then with this additional social signal, I think we can also ask the second question. Do they provide any useful market information? For example, do they predict future returns, future volatility, or trading volume, which can connect your paper to the disagreement picture? One observation, I think, is that the potential movements in the disagreement measure can also be consistent with patterns observed during the two information events studied in the paper. So for example, when the stock trades, when they relax the character limits, maybe potentially the investors can hold more extreme opinions, which leads to a stronger disagreement, which leads to a stronger return predictability. So my third comment is on how to reconcile with some of the early findings. Like I introduced in the beginning, most studies on the optimism tend to find a negative relationship between optimism and future returns. So here the author using social platform optimism, they find an opposite sign. They actually document a positive return predictability at the one-day horizon for both the social platforms and also the traditional news optimism. That is kind of the So I'm wondering whether this difference in result is driven by the horizon difference. Maybe here because it's one-day horizon and other studies at 1 week, 1 month, 1 year. Or because of the particular platforms studied in the paper actually are more informative than some of the other platforms studied in the early literature. And relatedly, the attention result in the paper also has an opposite sign to Da et al. 2011. So they find a positive sign at the short term, and the paper actually finds a negative. I also have a minor comments about how the abnormal return, which is a key variable, left-hand side variable in the paper, is calculated. So currently, the paper calculates the abnormal return as simply the stock return minus the market return without using any factor models. So I'm worried that this choice may actually make the regression to pick up some co-movements between the factor loadings and social signals like attention. So in some plausible scenarios, it may actually bias the author against finding some strong return predictability. And if I remember correctly, several early papers, they actually, for example, 4-factor adjusted outputs. So maybe this is something they also future. So just to conclude, I think this is a very interesting paper that opens up many possibilities for future research. So I think more can be done with this rich data set to understand better the social signal and their importance for the market outcomes. And I strongly recommend everyone to do it. Thank you.